So when I titled this sermon series, Living Resistance, Resisting Empire as a Way of Life, which will be a 10-week series starting today. I guess I like long sermon series or something, I don't know. But when I titled it that, I didn't remember that I'd read a book with that title. And so it must have been in my subconscious because I didn't intend to name it the same as the book. But to give credit where credit is due, the book is by an indigenous author named Caitlin B. Curtis, and its title is Living Resistance, an Indigenous Vision for Seeking Wholeness in Everyday Life. So with that in mind and that credit given, let's begin the sermon series. About 50 years after the fall of Rome, as the political and social world of the Roman Empire was crumbling, a man named Benedict of Nursia wrote a rule of monastic life. It was not the only or even the first monastic rule, but it was by far the most popular, and its popularity was due to several innovations. First, it was more moderate than the ones that came before it in terms of aesthetic practices that were required of the community. So, for instance, it allowed for moderate consumption of wine, while other rules demanded abstention. And so already people are like, hey, let's go to that one. It also gave specific instructions to the abbot of the monastery, emphasizing the abbot's need for humility, for servanthood, and it even required the abbot to get input from the community on major decisions. So it had a democratic element to it. It required a vow of stability, so that a community member had to commit to one monastery for their entire life, make a vow of stability to stay with that monastery. And that gave these new monasteries a stability as institutions that was new and different. And Benedictine's rule also prescribed a rhythm of daily life that was appealing. It had a balance of prayer and study and manual labor that people really liked. So with all of these elements in place, Benedictine monasteries proliferated as the social order that was provided by the Roman Empire was collapsing. As Europe entered its dark ages, these monasteries emerged as new stable centers of learning and charity and community life, and even prosperous economic centers as towns grew up around these stable communities. So perhaps there are lessons for us today as our social order seems to be crumbling on how we might respond and live. Now, none of us here lives in a monastic community or plans to, as far as I know. Maybe you do. But we can all learn something from the idea of having a rule by which we live. And in fact, inspired by these monastic rules, modern spiritual teachers often suggest that each person develop their own rule of life. A rule of life is individual, and it's a written statement of intention about the way we want to live in the world, the things we want to avoid and resist, the values and the virtues and the practices we want to embrace. It's about getting clear and specific about our commitments and intention for living. So as we are discerning how we are called to respond to the events of the world, both what's happening in this country and what's happening globally, when we feel this call to do stuff, to march, to protest, to vote, to write letters, to organize, to donate, to boycott, all of these ways that we are called to resist, how can we also incorporate our resistance into our daily lives, our everyday habits? Now, in some ways, we're starting in a deficit here, because making the concept of a communal rule individual is already a compromise with the values of the empire, the very empire we are trying to resist. The empire wants everything individual. You know, the global capitalist industrial world order thrives by isolating us. The less we depend on our extended families, on our local communities, for our survivals, for our support, the more we have to depend on the empire. So we're already handicapped by a communal spiritual practice like a rule of living that's become personal when it was intended to be communal. We would be so much stronger in our resistance to the destructive power of the empire if we could commit to a common set of practices together so that we could support each other and hold each other accountable as we attempt to live counterculturally. And maybe we'll get there someday. Maybe that's kind of where we will want to end up at some point. But in the meantime, we can still move toward greater resistance to the empire by doing the individual work of clarifying our intentions, defining our purpose, articulating our values, and nurturing our virtues. And perhaps that work can become communal simply in the support that we offer one another in these individual efforts. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about something called self-purification. He said it was a necessary part of any social movement. King taught that for a movement of social change to be successful, those in the movement had to go through a process of self-purification. So the soldiers in any nonviolent direct action campaign need to prepare themselves morally and spiritually for the challenges of such a campaign. If they're going to overcome hate with love, they better be strong in their capacity to love. If they intend to create transformative social tension through non-cooperation, they better have resilience to stand in that tension for a long time. So King offered some details about this idea of self-purification in a sermon entitled Mastering Ourselves. He said that the first step in the process is self-analyzation. Quote, "In this process, we must ascertain what our weaknesses are. No one can ever make improvements unless they know their points of weakness. Before the wise physician gives a patient medicine, they must find out where the sickness lies. This process of self-analysis is of primary importance, for it is the open door which leads to the room of improvement." And here, King's metaphorical flair. Next, he says we must admit that the weaknesses are weaknesses. And this seems really applicable to us today because of our human capacity to self-justify. He says, quote, "One of the tragedies of human nature is that a human has the power to adjust their mind to believe anything they want to. They have the power to convince themselves that wrong is right, that false is true, that low is high, and that bad is good. So if we do not admit that our weaknesses are weaknesses, the whole process of self-analyzation will have no meaning." Now, to me, this means that we need to be rigorously honest with ourselves and truly humble as we search our conscience and examine our behaviors. It's probably something we need divine help for, in fact, because many of the things that we'll have to address are unconscious biases. The only way to become conscious of unconscious biases may be with divine help. Next, King says we must be careful not to simply try to repress the negative aspects of ourselves. I think this is so important. Instead, he suggests a method of substitution. He writes, "We must find one good thing that we like to do as well as the evil thing. And every time we are persuaded to do the evil thing, the good will overwhelm it. This means that we must not concentrate on the eradication of evil, but on the development of virtue." He also suggests that we prioritize study and prayer. And for study, he recommends that we read books that uplift our character. We should always be trying to improve ourselves through our personal study habits. And then he gets downright mystical, writing that through this process of self-purification, our souls will, quote, "become united with the life of God. Yes, this is possible. We can know God. This has been the ringing cry of the mystic throughout the ages. God is not wholly other. God is not a process projected somewhere in the lofty blue. God is not a divine hermit hiding himself in a cave. God is a forever present with us. The God of religion is the God of life. God somehow transcends the world, yet at the same time is immanent in the world. And so by identifying ourselves with this knowable God, our wills will become somehow aligned with God's will. We will no longer think of our selfish desires. We will somehow rise above our evil thoughts. We will no longer possess two personalities but one. We will be true because God is truth. We will be just because God is justice. We will be love because God is love. We will be good because God is goodness. And we will be wise because God is wisdom. He had a way with words, didn't he? So I believe this process of self-purification has a lot in common with developing a rule of life. Though I really prefer the term rule of life because purification today really does have a moralistic and self-righteous feel to it, even though that's not what King intended. But a rule of life never suggests purity. In fact, it suggests that we need constant guidance, redirection, clarification as we navigate our daily lives. We need a goal to aspire to and a way to measure our progress. Richard Foster is a Quaker theologian who has written several definitive books on spiritual disciplines. He founded an organization called Renovare, which teaches spiritual practices. And an article on the Renovare website says that a rule of life is not simply a list of rules. It's not a list of do's and don'ts, of things that are prohibited and things that are allowed. It's more a rule in the sense of a ruler that you measure things with. You know those sticks with the marks on them, remember those? A ruler doesn't dictate how you use it, but it offers a straight edge and a consistent metric by which to measure things. A ruler allows us to create in ways that will stay within limits and give us perspective. If the moral landscape of our world is in constant flux, the ruler remains constant. So in the same way, a rule of life can be a consistent guide as we creatively live our daily lives in the midst of this changing world. So I'll just offer 6 qualities to guide the development of a rule of life. These are just qualities that a good rule of life will have. I'm not going to give you a step-by-step process on how to write one. I think it's sort of a creative process. But here are some principles. First, a rule of life is grounding. It's not about being super spiritual or righteous or pure. It should help us stay grounded in our humanity, reminding us that we are always of the earth. We have bodies with needs, and the rule will take those needs seriously. So it'll focus on things like the food we eat and how we eat it, our commitment to the wellness of our bodies through adequate rest, the way we work, how much we work, how we are at work, how we are in our family life, in our marriages, in our communities, and in our church, how we treat the earth. A rule of life should keep our feet on the ground. Second, a rule of life is life-giving. It's not about abstaining from all of the pleasures and good things in life, but it is about discerning which habits and choices and practices are really helpful to us to feel most alive. For instance, a recent survey found that more and more people, including young people, are drinking less or just giving up drinking altogether. And it's not because they're alcoholic or alcohol's ruining their life or they feel like they need to swear it off. But more people are just weighing the benefits of alcohol versus the costs. And I'm actually in that category. I love alcohol, right? I'm like Brett Kavanaugh, right? I love beer. Yeah. I love the way that it makes me feel in the short term, and I love the bonding experience of having a drink with people. But I also know that when I don't drink for an extended period of time, my overall mood is better and more stable. I sleep better, I have more energy, and I lose weight. So I haven't sworn it off. Maybe I'll have another drink someday. But I'm just not drinking right now because I've found that abstaining is so life-giving for me. And that's not true for everyone, and this may be a good example of why a rule of life can be a little bit individualized, why it's helpful, because if having a drink is life-giving for you, then why should you abstain? The key is discerning what's life-giving. Third, a rule of life is rhythmic. It focuses less on occasional events and more on regular habits. The way we eat, the time we go to bed and what we do before bed, for instance, the people we intentionally connect with every day, either by a phone call or a text or a visit, how we use our phones for online engagement in general, what we consume in the broadest sense, whether it's products or content. Also, what are our daily devotional practices, whether those are prayer or study or getting out in nature? Attending church is a devotional and community practice as well. Author James Clear says that every action we take is a vote for the person we want to become. So one choice on one day is not going to have a huge impact, But if we develop positive and life-giving habits, what we do and what we avoid, those habits will shape our character. Fourth, a rule of life should always engage us in the world. These are not just guidelines that are about us inside our prayer closet, but they're about creating relationships and connections. So yes, there are individual elements to it, but there are also, what are the ways that we are called to reach out and engage with the community? I mean, this was a communal practice originally. Fifth, a rule of life is sustainable. It involves looking honestly at our responsibilities and being realistic about what we can and cannot do. So if you have a baby at home or a young child at home, maybe you're not going to put in your rule of life that you're going to be in bed at the same time every night and you're going to wake up at the same time every morning, because that's just not realistic. But there are other ways to incorporate the reality of life with baby into the habits that we want to cultivate in our life. And finally, just as it's sustainable, a rule of life is also stretching. It's about growth. It's about getting stronger. We don't grow and get stronger without some effort and some intention. In fact, the title of the sermon series kind of has a double meaning. Living resistance is about resisting the values of the empire and living counterculturally in this culture of materialism and fear and division and violence. But resistance is also a kind of training, resistance training. Resistance training is about pushing against things that don't move easily and doing that over and over and over again in order to get stronger. So living resistance is about increasing our strength as individuals and as a people so that we can get better and stronger as we resist the empire. The Bible passage for today says that those who love God's instructions are like trees planted by the water whose leaves do not fade. A rule of life is a way to discern God's instructions for us, to discern what God is calling us to do every day. It reminds us where the water is flowing and where we want to put down our roots. So the invitation is that we each, sometime this week, take some time to reflect on our lives. What things do we do every day in which are life-giving and which are life-sucking? What choices and habits best reflect our values, especially in these times when the values of empire push us toward isolation and fear and inequality and destroy the planet and create despair? Are we resisting those forces with the life choices we make every single day? Are we living resistance? Amen.